G'day guys, Alex here and welcome to the Trademate Sports Betting Podcast. Today I'm joined by professional sports trader and founder of Bet Angel, Peter Webb. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi there.
Mate, you're obviously a very popular figure in the sports trading world. I'm sure that people watching this on YouTube or listening to the podcast have heard of you before, maybe seen a couple of your videos on YouTube and such. But yeah, maybe just give us a brief background. I know it's a very thorough background, but how you got started in the sports trading world and I guess your journey.
Yeah, I mean, it's been actually quite a long journey for me over a large number of years, but I've always loved sport, and that was the sort of initial spark for looking at all stuff to do with gambling and so on. But obviously I used to play it more than bet on it when I was younger. And my dad used to fill out a football pools coupon, which would basically, you'd have to guess the number of matches that would end in a draw. And I just sort of became fascinated by it. And I sort of said, what are you doing? And he said, well, if you get 8 of these correct, you win £1 million. A couple of million Aussie dollars. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. It can't be that difficult, can it? And that just sort of got me hooked on trying to understand the statistics and stuff. I didn't see it as a career back then. But yeah, I started to come up with models for football matches. And this was while I was still too young to bet, really. But I used to give him all the suggestions. He would do the entries, and then we'd sort of wait and see what would happen from there. And as I became more and more fascinated by it, I just became more fascinated by sports and gambling in general. And when I was at the library, this pre-internet days, I found Ed Thorpe's book, Beat the Dealer, which was all about card counting on blackjack. And that it got me fascinated all over again in terms of, he found a way of making the game fair to him and making money out of casinos. And I sort of had this dream that maybe I would be able to do that one day. But my early sort of forays into betting didn't really work out that well because I was getting restricted by bookies and all that sort of stuff. So I just thought, well, there's no point in doing this. But it sort of I went into financial markets, and then it went full circle because it was through financial markets that I discovered betting exchanges, and betting exchanges brought me back into the fold because it suddenly, all of those things I'd learned all those years ago gave me the opportunity to actually put it to use without any of the restrictions that I'd faced before. And within a few years of starting to use betting exchanges, I quit my normal career and started doing this full time, which was over 20 years ago now.
Yeah, wow, it's quite a story, mate. How did you, I guess, learn about, using the exchanges and just trading in general? Like, did you kind of, is it self-taught, or like what kind of resources were you, maybe you were learning from someone else? How did you build up to, or at least get started in the trading world?
Well, I sort of, when I came across betting exchanges, the thing that really appealed to me was that I was just betting against somebody else. And obviously if you're betting with a bookmaker, then you've got this issue that they probably don't want you to win one way or another, and you may be arbing or whatever you want to do. There's a finite limit to how much you could actually put through with a bookmaker or any traditional betting. So the thing that drew me to exchanges was the fact that there was no limit, but they were very, the thing that appealed to me is they were positioned like a stock market for sports, where you could basically buy and sell, you could back or lay, you could do all those things. But right at the very beginning, I joined Betfair and a whole load of other exchanges, but just days after they opened. So everything I had to do was completely self-taught. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing or the way that these things worked. And it was a case of just going in there, giving things a try, and sort of messing around, for want of a better word. And I already had some pricing models that I'd done on football, stroke soccer. But so I sort of went into the market to either find value or to price up markets, do all of those sort of things. And I also used to do a fair bit of arbing, because back in the very early days, there were very few people that really knew about betting exchanges. So I'd go to any bookmaker that would give me decent odds and then just lay it off on the exchange, and I would arb. And that sort of led on to all of the trading stuff that sort of followed. But there was nobody for me to look to. I just had to do it all myself. I was probably a small handful of people that sort of saw the opportunity and started messing around. So a bit of trial and error, a bit of sort of logic and knowledge, but I had to sort of do it all myself right at the very beginning.
So if I was speaking to, I guess, Peter Webb of 20, 30, 40 years ago, when you first started on the exchanges, would you say, do you think he would have any chance nowadays if he was just getting started in 2021 with no knowledge at all, no one to learn from, and just kind of, self-taught? How do you think he would perform in today's age?
Well, I think it's easier in some aspects because you can see that people have done it or are doing it. So you know that it can be done and that there are interesting things that you can do. But I think that obviously the market's much more competitive than it was then. But if you look at the sort of things that I do, I tend to have to focus on where there is the most amount of money within the market, because as you participate in the market over a large number of years and you gradually get bigger, it becomes less interesting to be able to bet on smaller events and secondary markets and smaller leagues and stuff like that. You tend to have to go where the money is. So necessarily, if you go into some of the big markets, then obviously I'll be ever present in those. But some of the smaller markets, you probably find are less competitive and slightly more niche. But you know, they're usually, when I fire up Bet Angel in the morning, there are usually sort of 10 to 15,000 markets on there. So I'm pretty sure that there's one for everybody, and it often makes sense to focus in on something that you enjoy, that you have specialist knowledge in, and where you think you can actually find an edge. So, you know, you sort of naturally settle into one of those areas.
So what were some of the challenges that you faced in your early days? I mean, you've obviously mentioned that you were self-taught for most of it. What were some of the challenges you faced? There's all sorts of stuff going on behind you, mate, but that's all right. I guess some of the biggest issues that sports traders, or at least just yourself, that you faced when you first started.
Yeah, I think probably the biggest issue that I faced in all of these sort of years is I think there was if you do anything to do with sports betting, especially back when I started, I think that people think you're just completely crazy. It's always the hardest question to answer. You go to some sort of social event and people say to you, "What do you do for a living?" And if you say to them, "Oh, I'm a professional gambler," or there's something that along those lines, then you get a fair amount of skepticism. And I think that when I first started out, I expected that, but probably not after all of these years. But it's still something that I think still has a bit of a stigma attached to it. It's very hard to explain. And when people say to me, "What do you do for a living now?" I just say, I watch sports for a living, because that's a much more interesting answer. and that could mean anything. So it's much easier to say that than, you gamble or you trade or you do any of those things. It's just a much easier answer to do with it. But I think when I first started, there were a huge number of barriers to entry, and I think those barriers to entry are a lot lower now. And there are many things that you can sort of progress forward on, and it's got a little bit more legitimacy. But I still face that issue of people not really fully understanding exactly what I do or why.
So over all these years of sports trading, your biggest challenge is talking to those around you about what you do and nothing to do with the actual betting.
Yeah, I feel very comfortable. I mean, I do honestly love what I do, because you get to watch sports. I've always been into the stats side of it for quite a large number of years, and I enjoy the process of doing it. It's fun. You have good and bad days and difficult moments and fantastic moments. But the actual process of doing all of that is the thing that sort of, wakes me up every morning. I keep thinking that there's another problem to solve. So the actual process of going through it is a joy to me, really. And all of the issues that surround it are more either industry related or other stuff like that. I don't. I always approach each day with a lot of enthusiasm, and I'm always looking for something interesting and new to try and find, and that's what sort of keeps me motivated, really.
In terms of the actual just sports trading, though, were there any like teething problems or I guess challenges that you've faced? I know you just mentioned you've had both good and bad days, so maybe just harp on some of the biggest challenges that you faced in terms of just the actual trading side of things.
Yeah, well, when I started because trading is, you can summarize it as just trying to back at two different sets of odds and net the profit between the two. But I didn't even know really that you could do that when I first started. It was an accident that I sort of did it. I went in, tried to get rid of a bet that I'd placed, and then suddenly I'd realized I'd actually created a little profit. And trying to do that seriously was probably the biggest challenge, because there was no API, there was no software, and that was how BetAngel was born. It was born out of the back of that, because I'd been doing lots of stuff in financial markets, wanted to do it in sports markets, and I needed to create the software to do that. So that was the first hurdle to overcome. But when that was overcome, everything just suddenly sort of took off. But I think the issues that you face along the way are many, really, because I think from when I was very young, I tended to be quite risk averse. And people who know me now would think that was crazy. But it's sort of almost human nature to be able to fear taking some sort of level of risk. Ultimate way of actually taking a little bit of risk. So as a consequence, that's what sort of tends to catch people out when things go wrong, or maybe actually taking an opportunity itself. That can be pretty hard, and nobody's perfect. You're either perfect or a liar, and nobody's perfect. And as a consequence, you are going to have little bad runs, you're going to have bad days, or you're going to make a mistake. So overcoming those and having the right mindset and approach to doing that is an important thing to get to grips with, because if you do spectacularly well, you should almost sort of bank that to a certain extent to cover yourself for when things don't perhaps work out. And, you know, even now I'll make the odd mistake, but that's all part of the mix. But being able to come to terms with that is actually quite a hard thing to do. And I think that's what catches people out a lot when I talk to people or advise people who are starting out. They go on a bad run and they somehow feel an urgent need to correct that, when in fact very often that is just part of the whole betting and trading process.
Yeah, certainly. In our exchange of emails, I think, you mentioned something really interesting, and I'll just quote you here. You said, I'm probably nothing like anybody you have interviewed before. Most people recognize me because I'm associated with BetAngel, but I've got a deep and rich betting history with weekly turnover in the millions. So, I mean, that's a very eye-catching comment, mate. Do you want to kind of, talk me through your process of finding your selections and trading and all that kind of stuff, and why it's so important for you to be turning over such large amounts of money?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't actually start like that. It was very small to start with. And when you sort of solve one problem in the market. So when I first tried to do this full time, I knew a lot about soccer, and I could model a soccer market really well. I could price it. I knew where the odds should be and could take advantage of that. But I was also doing a lot of stuff on financials. So back in the very early days, Betfair had little financials, which you could bet on as well. So I would do that. But both of those were a small part of a much, much bigger picture. And I became absolutely fascinated with horse racing. And the thing that fascinated me with horse racing is that it was turning over tens of billions of pounds a year. And I thought, well, if I can solve one market problem, I can probably solve a few other market problems. And that sort of sucked me into horse racing. That's probably the wrong word to use there. I became fascinated by horse racing. And trying to solve the problem of how to be able to bet on horse racing. But one of the appealing things about horse racing is that you can have so many races over the course of the day. If you look at, spring carnival time in Australia, and you look at the racing card on a Saturday, you've got like 4,000 races running simultaneously in all four corners of Australia. And it's the same in the UK. At the peak times of the year, you get a huge number of races. And as a consequence, you could actually have a bet on a particular race, and then there'll be another one along in 5 minutes' time. So by default, if you get involved in more sports, especially on horse racing, you tend to find that the frequency of bets that you can place is going to be very high. And if you can find an edge, even an absolutely tiny one in a horse racing market, part of the opportunity there is just the number of events that takes place. So you could potentially get sort of in the UK 3 races in the afternoon, 3 in the evening, each of them having 7 races on each of those individual cards. Suddenly you're talking about sort of 40 or so races over the course of a day. So just by default, you end up betting large amounts of money, and your edge is only ever going to be a percentage of that. And over time, as you get more confident with what you're doing, you try and gradually raise stakes to the level at where you feel you're not going to sort of damage that edge. And just slowly over a period of time, you end up turning over much, much larger amounts.
So would you say the reason why you're betting so much is because maybe your edge is a lot, maybe, I don't know how obviously big it is, but would you say it's minimal in the sense that, like, for you to gain the most out of that edge, you have to place a lot of money on it?
Basically, yeah. I think you probably summarized it quite well. And so I'm looking for as many markets as I can. And some of the stuff I do is manual. Some of it is automated because we now have APIs that you can send bets through to all the different exchanges. So it's either scanning for an opportunity for me to look at, or it's either taking part in that opportunity, or I'm actually doing it myself. So as a consequence, there's effectively like many of me at the same time looking to try and find opportunities within the market and take advantage of them. So yeah, a lot of it comes down to that. The number of markets that I'll bet on in any individual week is quite high, and then during peak periods it will be enormous. But that is a function of I'm happy to take quite thin margins, and my edge is relatively small in the scheme of things. And then I just try and replicate that as many times as I can.
Yeah, 100%, mate. And I recently this morning I saw a Twitter comment on an article that we wrote about a football tipster who had an ROI of 4%, and he was saying how that's just such a poor ROI. And it's just like, mate, if you can put thousands, millions of dollars on a 4% ROI, you're going to be a very rich man. So I don't understand why people frown at even like a 1% ROI. If you can bet a 1% ROI at a betting exchange or a sharp bookmaker over and over and over every single day, you're most likely going to be a millionaire pretty quick.
Exactly. I mean, you've absolutely nailed it. And people don't seem to realize that. And the markets are competitive. So, if you think you could get 10%, I think that that would be unbelievable, really, because if you're willing to take 10, somebody will take 9, then somebody will take 8 and 6 and 7 and 5. So in a competitive market, you've got to expect your ROI to be quite small and probably declining a lot of the time. And therefore, if you're going to make a decent amount of money with a small ROI, you have to put through as much as you possibly can without influencing the odds.
Yeah, certainly, mate. I think the most interesting thing that you mentioned to me throughout our email exchanges was that I guess the last 10 years, you're saying, you originally started, like you mentioned before, doing a lot of modeling on football and these kind of things. But now over the last 10 years, you've transitioned to I don't even know how to, I guess, a psychological approach to betting the markets. I guess that's kind of a very broad term, and it means absolutely nothing. It sounds very, very interesting. So that's that's my question, I guess, is can you explain exactly what you mean by that? Because it does sound very, very interesting. It sounds unlike anything that anyone else does.
Yeah, well, it's sort of, I think all the best things happen by accident. And, you have to be inquisitive and forward thinking and positive thinking and looking for opportunities. I often say this, that if you have a positive mind, you find opportunities, and if you have a negative mind, you find problems. So I've always approached the markets with this view that there's always something to learn, and it doesn't matter how silly something seems, you should give it a try and try and learn from it. But I had a conversation with some people. I mean, pretty much all the way throughout my career, I touched on it sort of earlier, where this general level of skepticism sort of was there at the beginning, which I totally understand, was there 10 years ago, which was frustrating, and is still there today, where people sort of say, well, isn't the market efficient? Can't you do this? Can't you do that? And there's that sort of undercurrent that runs through it all. And it got to the point where I couldn't understand, when I was talking to people about what I do, why they were still skeptical, because I was sort of thinking, well, I've done it for so long, I've kept good records, so, you know, all of these sort of things. And it began to dawn on me that whatever you say to somebody, and you see this in politics and in life in general, you know, you always end up with two different views. If you had a referendum on one thing or another, it seems to always end up at 50-50. For some reason, people always want to take opposing sides to it. And I became quite fascinated by why this was the case. And I sat down with somebody one day and said, look, if you do this, the worst you could ever possibly do is break even, because it's all going to balance out. And this guy came back to me and said, oh, I've just lost 20 races in a row. And it was like, how could you possibly do that? That even if you just tossed a coin, that's about 1,000,000 to 1 shot. There's absolutely no way that you could do that by pure chance. So there must be something else going on. And then I sort of descended into this rabbit hole of trying to understand the psychology of what people do in the market and the way that they do it. And that sort of changed everything that I do, because prior to that point, I was going into, say, tennis, creating a model where I could say, if this player is set up and 2 games up and is serving in this particular set, what should his odds be? And if the odds are different from what I expect, then there's probably an opportunity. And I suddenly turned the whole thing sort of on its head and sort of said, you know, where is it likely that we're going to find the best opportunity within this market? What's the potential for an opportunity in this market? So my approach sort of shifted over the years from modeling and looking at it from a quant perspective, effectively, to actually going into the market and beginning to understand where people are more likely to make mistakes. So if you look at tennis, for example, a tennis player should be fairly consistent with their serve. But you notice that certain tennis players, and it's a general characteristic, but it's very specific on certain tennis players, alter the speed of their serve depending upon the points that they're serving within a game and within a set. So you can almost read their mind in terms of what they're thinking based upon how they're likely to serve. And once you begin to understand the characteristics of that player, you can begin to understand what they're likely to do next. And necessarily that leads you into an opportunity, whether it's to do with trading or betting. And you find the same characteristics in golf, and you find opportunities in tennis, in soccer, in all different sports that are geared up around those sort of characteristics. So I've sort of shifted over the years from having a purely statistical model to one where, instead of trying to find the discrepancy, I'm looking for where the discrepancy is likely to exist, and then I'm hanging out in the market around that point and waiting for it to happen. And you also find it within the betting market as well. You see those characteristics plastered all over the betting market.
So would you say that you've almost like profiled, I mean, you bet into, I don't think we've even mentioned this, but you bet into tennis, golf, soccer, horse racing, or football. Sorry for those who get offended when I say soccer. Like that's a lot of sports, and most people, at least most professional sports bettors, will only focus on maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 sports. So have you, because you're talking about these psychological tendencies of a tennis player or something like that, there are hundreds of professional tennis players out there. So do you have like a database of like, I don't know, you profiled these tennis players in some way like that? It sounds very like that would take a lot of time. So can you maybe just explain like your process of finding out like Roger Federer or something. I know he's like the most popular tennis player of all time, but your process of, I guess, from day one of profiling him.
Yeah, and it's a very important. I think this is always one of the big myths. Is like, it always sounds really glamorous. What do you do for a living? Oh, I sit down, I watch some sport on the TV, and then I have a few quid on it, and hey, I'm rich. And when I'm not doing that, I'm cleaning the car outside, or I'm sat by the pool or something. It sounds like fantastic because you just watch something, you place a few quid on it, and that's it. You suddenly make money. But the reality is probably 80% of my time is spent gathering the data, looking at the data, sorting through it, comparing stuff, looking for new opportunities, checking what I've done and whether it's valid or not. So I collect a lot of data, probably really more data than I can reasonably manage at times. But some of it I'll just park, and others I'll look at it forensically. But on tennis, for example, I'll have every single action within a tennis match listed by player across hundreds of thousands of tennis matches. And I'm just looking for a variance to the mean. Does a player sort of behave slightly differently at certain points? But the same thing will happen in different sports as well. So I know, and I don't do every single tennis match that's there. I have to tend to stick to matches that have a reasonable amount of volume. And in golf, I've done the same sort of thing on golf. So I know the characteristics of individual players and what they're likely to play like and their style of play. But I won't follow them around the globe and bet on the Swedish Open or something. But I will definitely do the Masters and all of the majors and the big tournaments where there's enough liquidity to make that worthwhile. So I have a tendency to dip in and out. But in terms of data, research, and all of that, that's probably where I spend most of my time. And the fun bit, which is watching it and betting on it, is probably a minority of all of that activity.
So would you say is it all data led, I guess? So you're not actually just sitting there hours on end every day, watching these players play a game of tennis or, playing golf. Like it's all kind of sent to you in the data, and then your the hard part for you is going through that data and making sense of it.
Well, I think you need to have the data there to be able to justify what you're doing or why you're doing it. So you learn that certain players, rather than attack a pin, will probably lay it up, for example, in golf, whereas others will be a bit more adventurous, but some of that is dependent upon where they are within the tournament. But you have to watch sport because that is the lifeblood of it all. Because when you're watching the sport, you need to be in Phil Mickelson's head when he's heading up the 18th and, he's 2 shots ahead to think, what is he going to do next? How is he likely to play this? Or, we can all tell that Rafa Nadal at the French Open is going to adjust his hair, touch his ear, pull up his shorts, bounce the ball 16 times, and then attempts to serve it. So you're looking for those sort of characteristics and any change within that. So it obviously helps to watch the sport, but you do that naturally anyway. I think the thing that you have to do is to use the data to detach yourself from the emotion of the sport. So, I won't, during Euro 2020, I won't bet on England simply because, at the back of my head will be thinking, oh, wouldn't it be great if they win this match? Or why doesn't they put this player on? Or, you have to try and detach yourself from the emotion of it. And stats are a good way of doing that, I think.
So I guess the best way to sum it up is it's a mixture of both. I guess your opinion, your emotions from watching a game, and also looking at the data too.
Yeah, and I think from a psychological perspective, and I often say this to people if they're betting in play or they're trading or they're doing anything like that, is it very often makes sense to do the opposite of what you think when you first start out, because you get sucked into the emotion when you first attempt to do this. And it almost inevitably leads you into the complete opposite position that I would tend to take in some of these sports.
Yeah. And do you have any background in psychology at all? Or is it more so just you've watched so much sport now that you can, I guess, profile a player or a team a lot easier?
Yeah, I had to. I went off to university lectures and watched stuff on YouTube and bought loads of books and started to, make a nuisance of myself with people who had done it all before me. But there is some really good quality stuff out there, but you have to do it at quite a base level and then build your knowledge on top of that. But I think it's an underrated and fascinating area of sport, simply because once you begin to understand, you almost have to put yourself in the shoes of those people, and you need to understand what they're thinking and the way that they're thinking about stuff. But you see it permeate right through sports, but also curiously right across the markets. If somebody, if a jockey rides a 4-timer at a meeting somewhere, where's the money going to go on that 5th race? Everybody will pile in on it, regardless of whether it's value or not. They've just seen him win 4 times. They want to win the next race. So that's the most logical bet. So it sort of transcends all of those different areas of the markets. It's a really fascinating area to get involved in.
Yeah, so I guess the first half is of your process is finding a tendency of a player and then being backed up by the data or vice versa. But then there's the next step, which is looking at the odds and seeing if the odds are valuable. If you like Roger Federer's next serve to be a double fault or something like that, but the odds of that are 1.01, then that doesn't do anything for you probably. I know that's probably a terrible example, but what about? But
you're in the right area there, yeah.
Yeah. So can you kind of explain your process then of then looking at the markets? And is it just a quick look at like, all right, that number looks like value to me, or is there more to it? Are you kind of pricing it up in your head, or thinking of like a percentage chance and then converting that to the odds?
Yeah, typically the latter. So I'll have a good idea of. I work in percentages all the time. So if I see decimal odds of 6, I know that's 16.67. If I see decimal odds of, varying amounts, then they will convert in my head automatically. But there was a tweet I sent out I was doing the UK racing this afternoon, and there was a horse that was really incredibly heavily backed. So I could sort of tell why it was being backed, because it had a favourable stall draw, and all of the favourites, or the winning horses on this particular day, were drawn similar or close to this particular draw. But based upon its form lines, everything I knew about the jockey and everything to do with it, there seemed to be no logical reason. I knew roughly what price he should be based upon the way that the market was structured, but the price had moved about 15% from where I thought the price should be. So that just screamed value to me in terms of laying it, not backing it. And when you approach a situation, that's how it tends to happen. You see something within the market, you see Federer, being a set and a break up or something. You look at the odds and you're thinking, well, that looks wrong. And then you're trying to quantify what you see with what you would expect. But then you obviously need to try and understand why that could be the case. And in the case of the racing this afternoon, there's absolutely no way that this horse had improved in ability just because it was drawn low today. There was nothing in its form line or its previous runs and with all of the other runners in this race to suggest that was a valid price. So the market just went mad at that moment. Everybody piled onto it. And, I just took the opposite side of that.
And this change from modeling to betting purely based on, the psychology, as you called it, were there any problems there to begin with? Like, did you struggle with the change in strategy, or were there any just challenges in general with betting that way?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing that changed was me, in all honesty, because when I first started off down this path, I was a bit of a skeptic around, because you often hear it in financial markets where people are going, the psychology of trading and your mind and stuff like that. And you sort of think, well, this is somebody who wants to sell me a 50 quid ebook or something, or make me go on a £1,000 course to mysteriously turn around my trading. So I was very skeptical to start with, but the deeper and deeper I dug, the more I realized there was some actual substance there. And there are some sort of general flaws or curious ways in terms of the way that people think and what they do and why they do those things. And once you get to that level, then I think you begin to fully understand. But I remember my first attempts on trading tennis was I would think, well, this guy's won. There's no way he's going to lose this. So I'll just back him, even at short odds, because he's going to go on and win this. And then sure enough, the whole thing would swing round in the other direction. Or there would be somebody that was about to lose and you think, well, he's definitely lost. And then he gets a break and then the other player double faults. And then suddenly the whole match is turned around on its head. So when I first started doing this, going through that change of being able to do something that felt right, you had this gut feel that seemed right, I almost had to turn that on its head and start looking at it from a completely different perspective. And I think that was the thing that I struggled with most. And that's the thing that a lot of people struggle with when they're actively trading as well, because very often you have to do things that just feel counterintuitive. But that's all part of the process of understanding the psychology of either yourself in terms of taking risk or exactly what's going on the field of play.
Yeah, I mean, your approach is really interesting because I think the last decade of especially a sport like football or soccer is that it's turned into a very data-heavy sport now. I mean, the emergence of underlying data like XG, or expected goals for those who have never heard of XG, it seems like that's the way to go. And the problem with that is people's betting edges have heavily diminished because the people that were using that data, it's all public info now, so it's all kind of factored into the odds. So is that kind of why you're maybe leaning more on the psychological approach now, because it's pretty hard to have an edge when you're just using data that basically everyone else can use too?
I think it's sort of inevitable. I mean, it's like I priced my first football/soccer match back in the late 80s, and it was quite a crude model, and I had nothing to compare it to, and it was sort of quite basic, but it was still way ahead of anything that other people were doing around that time. I was betting heavily on it in the 90s, but you try and use that model now, and it's toast. It's of no use to anybody. And you see that reflected in the markets. You see people become more efficient, people use slightly different models, or they push the boundaries of what those models can do. So it's important that you have some appreciation of what the price should be. But in terms of finding a very specific edge within there, I think that's always going to be hard, especially in this day and age when the amount of technology, I mean, the amount of statistics you can get on a soccer match now is insane. If I would have had this 30 years ago, I would have been a billionaire by now. But, the quality of information is absolutely outstanding now on most sports. But the funny thing, edges and things like that change over time and become more efficient. But I think that one enduring quality that I've seen that never changes is human nature. When I started spotting things in the markets that made no sense, I couldn't explain it, I couldn't quantify it. And it was only when I looked at the psychology of all of this, I began to understand exactly what was going on and why these errors were occurring. And these errors seem to keep replicating themselves time and time again. It's a really curious thing, but it's a sort of a blend of having some data available that justifies what you're doing and understanding the price, but then where the errors are likely to occur, so you try and anticipate those errors.
Yeah. I think the obvious question here for everyone, I don't know if anyone else is thinking this, but you've talked a lot about psychology of tennis and golf players and maybe soccer and football teams too. But how on earth does this work with horses? Because I don't know about you, mate, but I can't read what a horse is thinking.
Yeah, no, it's funny actually. This was of all the markets that I do, I enjoy the horse racing the most because it is quite inherently unpredictable. And if you talk to a soccer player just before they go out on the pitch, you can motivate them and say, right, I want you to go down the left wing, and if this player does this, then do that. But of course, you talk to a horse and it will just look at you blankly and do whatever it wants. So, but that creates a lot of uncertainty in the market, and the uncertainty, I think, drives a lot of the errors that you see. It's very unusual. Probably you would use the psychology more in the betting market on horse racing than you would on the actual race itself, which is usually reasonably well structured.
Yeah. Okay. And do you I mean, I guess I assume you're using the exchanges predominantly now. You're not using sports books or betting into bookmakers at all?
No, the advantage for me, anyway, of exchanges is that there's no cap on the amount of money that you can bet or the number of markets that you can bet. And you can also automate some of it as well. So using BetAngel, it's easy to point that at a range of markets and manage many, many more markets on an exchange. So some of those volume numbers come from that in terms of, if I was to try and do that with a sports book or a traditional bookmaker, it's just not possible.
Yeah.
So being able to do that on a variety of different exchanges gives me the ability to look for opportunities and automate some of that and increase the volume that I'm putting through the market.
Would you say that's the sole reason why you choose betting exchanges and trading over betting with sports books, in the fact that you can't be limited, or are there more, I guess, advantages for you of using an exchange over a sports book?
Yeah, I think that's the primary reason. That's why I ended up on exchanges in the first place, because I suddenly realized that there was a market that I could bet into where I knew that my bet was going to be honored, and there was sort of no cap on what I could do effectively. And that appeal of betting against somebody else, rather than a bookmaker, be them corporate or independent, sort of reduced some of the risk for me. So that was the appeal of being able to do that, and that's sort of primarily why I've ended up there. And you look at the exchange. If you look at the Betfair exchange, I don't have numbers for all the exchanges, but they'll probably match maybe around 90 billion pounds, so 180 billion Aussie dollars or thereabouts. I can't remember what the exchange rate is at the moment. It's roughly 2 to 1. I think it may have shifted a bit recently. But so when you look at that amount of money, you sort of think, all I need is a very, very small edge, and I'll do just fine. And that level of transparency and the ability to do it, and also, the BetAngel was created to work like you would in a financial market. So it's based upon software that you would find in financial markets, and you can just bring up a whole load of markets. You can be active in all of them. And that's one of the big advantages of being able to do that, is the immediacy of it, the scale of it, and all of those sort of things. So it's a very different way from a traditional sort of betting method or background that you would conventionally see.
And how do you see the future of trading? You've been here you've been in the industry and using the exchanges for a long time now, and I'm sure you've seen a big difference from when you started to where it is today, with the emergence of stuff like artificial intelligence and bots and all this kind of fancy stuff. How do you see it in the next 10 or so years, and how you fit into that from someone that's been around for a long time and having to adapt as you go along?
Yeah, well, I've been doing it for so long now that I've got my children interested in it. My children are now old enough to do it all themselves. So it seemed like a natural progression to hand over some things to them. Whether they want to carry on doing that and how much enthusiasm they have for it is open to question. But it's there for them to do that. I think, I'm actually sort of slightly disappointed in where we've reached currently, because when I first started on the exchanges, they were pretty much global. And really, when you look at a lot of countries now, they've sort of introduced legislation that limits your ability for their citizens to be able to use the exchanges either in the country or outside of it. So, I mean, we've got the turnover charge in Australia, which isn't particularly helpful for New South Wales racing. And I think that sort of legislation has sort of clipped the wings of exchanges a bit, because when I first started, I imagined it may be a lot bigger than it is now. I mean, it's still big, but I imagined it may be some sort of global giant that sort of, totally transformed the way that betting worked. But fundamentally, in some territories, it hasn't at all. So if you go to North America, they're still prehistoric in terms of the way that they wager in North America. And when I've taken trips over there to explain to them the concept of what I do and how I do it and what an exchange is, their minds are completely blown. And you're sort of thinking, this is the USA. This is, supposedly the biggest economy in the world, has just not adopted them and probably won't adopt them anytime soon. So I'm sort of, I think there will always be opportunities, and where some edges fade and some sports die, others will replace them. But it would be nice to see it on a much bigger, broader global scale. So, one of the areas that I grew into was Australian racing. So after I'd worked out what to do in the UK, I immediately turned to Australia because there's, very good quality meetings over there. There's decent turnover. And I just thought, well, I'm sure I can do it there too.
Yeah, awesome, mate. We've gone through a lot of different topics today, and you've probably mentioned the answer to this question a few times. But if we had to summarize everything and you had to give just one piece of advice to traders wanting to improve their trading and get to the next level, or maybe some advice for someone who's just getting started, what would be your one, I guess, summary or piece of advice for those people?
It's funny because you say one. It's probably the hardest thing to narrow it down to.
Give me five then, mate.
Yeah. I was asked this question once before, and my response to it actually was price. It's price is everything. And if you can get the best price that you can, whether it's, through execution, finding the best price, being creative in terms of how you place your bet or what you're betting on. If you can get a good price, whether you're betting or trading, that will be massively beneficial to you. And I think, in all honesty, probably doing this successfully, half the battle is with yourself. People's minds are geared towards being risk averse, but actually you have to get very familiar with going into a market and thinking, well, I think I've got this right, and I'm pretty sure the price is out, but I don't know. And I think probably the biggest change that I've had in 20 years is that when those decisions come now, I'm quite happy to do that, and I'm quite willing to put my neck on the line. And when I see people starting out, very often they're not willing to do that, or they're doing it for the wrong reason. So I think coming to terms with that and focusing on that as well, in terms of having a consistent plan, executing to it well, regardless of the situation that's in front of you, gives you a level of consistency where you can begin to improve. But a lot of people never are able to reach that. So yeah, I think a little bit of psychology there and a little bit of price, which is more or less what we've actually discussed. But yeah, I think those are two very important aspects.
Yeah, definitely, mate. I love what you said about the price. My dream in life is for someone out there, and maybe it's already been done, is for someone to just bet based on what they think, like do no research, no modeling, anything like that. Just bet on any game that they want, whatever team they like, player, but always take the best price. And I want to see how that ends up over time, because I'm almost convinced that maybe they won't be a winner, but maybe they'll be break even over thousands of bets, or maybe they'll be a slight loser or something like that. Because I think just if you're a punter out there and someone that's not interested at all in doing research on your bets or anything like that, but if you just always took the best price available, I'd love to hear how that ends up over time, because I'm sure that even if you were a loser, it wouldn't be by that much.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's if you can just squeeze a little bit more out of it, and you do it over a large number of events, it's amazing what a difference that will make.
Yeah. All right. Awesome, Pete. It's been great having you on today, mate. We've gotten through a lot, and I think the whole psychological approach to your betting is fascinating, and I hope it implores people to, or motivates them to, maybe take a similar approach or take bits and pieces of what you said today into their own betting and trading, mate. Do you want to just quickly let people know where they can find you and BetAngel, and maybe any projects you've got coming up and stuff like that?
Yeah, thank you. if you visit betangel.com, you can find the software. You can get a free trial on it, and we've got some free versions of it as well if you want to use it on different exchanges. You'll find me on Twitter as BetAngel and on YouTube as well. But if you can't find me immediately, you can always go through the links on the site to be able to do that. And if you're interested more specifically in some of the detail that I've touched on, we have a website called the BetAngel Academy, and that has a lot of information on there as well. And some of the videos I've grouped together there from YouTube, so they're in a more sensible format and you don't get distracted by funny cats and dogs in between trying to learn something useful. So yeah, plenty of resources if people are interested.
No, tremendous, mate. I know lots of people that use your software and are very familiar with your channels and all your resources. So well done on that too. And thanks for coming on, of course. And thanks everyone for listening. For those listening on the podcast version, if you could subscribe, that would be tremendous. If you're listening on YouTube or watching on YouTube, subscribe, like, comment any questions that you might have, or comments on the on the podcast. Yeah, the CD thumbs up always helps. And yeah, if you're looking to implement some of the strategies that we talked about today, maybe not so much the sports trading ones, but we talked a little bit about sports betting there today, start a free week trial of Trademate Sports and start taking the best prices, as I mentioned before. Peter, it's been fabulous, mate, and yeah, we'll have to catch up sometime later down the line.
Yep, no, thank you very much for inviting me on.
Cheers, mate.
Thank you.